All right, we're talking the advantage of aeration and decompaction and how it accelerates and stimulates the feeding of trees. How do you feed a tree? Actually, you can't feed a tree. What you can do is provide elements next to the roots, and in order to do that, you've got to create the air spaces for these elements to be placed next to the roots. And these elements have to be converted, digested, and put into a form that the trees can readily absorb and take up into their systems. The difference between organic and chemical primarily is chemical fertilizers are readily available in their current form to be taken up by the trees more so than an organic form of humates, earthworm castings, or sea kelp, which has to be broken down and further digested and more slowly released over a period of time. And we're not actually against using chemicals. We are against using chemicals when they are off target. They must be focused into areas. We've used chemicals with certain trees and groups of plants that have been under such stress that we felt like if we didn't take immediate action, roughly equivalent to you going into the emergency room for an IV injection, then we felt like the chemicals could be used, but they must be focused in the area of the roots, and the aeration and decompaction process does that. Roots are actually the tree's stomach combined with the leaves, which capture energy, and combined with water turn that CO2 from the atmosphere into sugar that, believe it or not, most of it is passed down into the roots, out through the little fine root hairs, and used to entice relationships with other living organisms in the soil. And so a good soil mixture is 50% air, and I think you're beginning to see why we need to aerate and decompact to make sure that these spaces are where they need to be. Organics break down more slowly, and they will give a signal more slowly to the tree. We'll get into the difference between the very direct chemical stimulation of nitrogen-based fertilizers, chemical fertilizers in our biostimulant section, but right now we're talking about providing the space for the nutrients and the water, and the air must precede these in order to do it. This is a part of what we refer to as a new green shift, where we are shifting responsibility for these actions over to the trees and the plants themselves. They have established systems that can handle these processes if they are balanced using our four elements of water, air, nutrients, and energy. And that is what you are going to use to trade for the services that they do. And this is referred to as our new view of home ecology. And the work with the air tools, both the big one and the little one, supersonic air is exactly the right tool, the right place to get a cheap to keep result, because it doesn't interfere with any of the systems there. It doesn't damage the roots. Roots are non-porous. The air goes around it and only begins to move, pulverize, and rearrange the soil around it. As we have explained before, all of these tree preservation actions, especially with your aeration and decompaction, logically lead or bleed into additional actions that we have called our 6 tree preservation actions. The next actions for this tree would typically be to extend the mulch zone as the tree, bushy plants, or groupings are needed. This includes soil formation, turf reduction, erosion control, and water savings. And remember, people are so reluctant to give up their grass at certain times. Tell them that when we began to soil formation and aeration and decompaction, at any time they want to reclaim that with turf in the future, if water restrictions should be lifted and the weather gets better and things should change, or ownership should change and they want to have a new wrinkle to their designed ecosystem, none of this is permanent. It can always be reversed. And so at this point, I would tell you business owners, our contractors, please educate your operators, the people that are out there in the customer's designed ecosystems, to tell this same story when asked by the customer. I can't tell you how many times that we've gone to a customer's property and we've got two people, one handling the hose, one handling the air gun, visiting the trees that have been bid and agreed to in the job quote, and a third person talking to the owner and explaining to them what to do. Now, some of this can be handled with video demonstrations, and you can get them on your website and some of the other advantages that we've talked about if you use the Cheap to Keep Tree and Landscape program. But it's worth mentioning that the way you bill and the way you handle these customers is going to have a huge effect on how they add additional services on. Your use of the tree preservation actions and the capacity that you introduce to this designed ecosystem to become cheap to keep is going to be a major story that you will begin to educate your customer to as time goes on. They're not going to get the whole story all at once and absorb it. You're going to have to give it to them little bit by little bit. And the only additional caveat that I can add to this is that if you don't have the big gun, which we've talked about with the 375 CFMs, it's going to take a little longer. You're going to have to bill a little bit more for it, and we found that the surface granular material gets spread around a little bit more, and it makes sometimes a bigger mess. And so understand that there's a lot of elements here that can be explained to the customer. And so when you send your operators out there on site, make sure that they've understand how to explain this to the customer if they're quizzed. Now, as you begin to educate your customers and feed them these top-line ideas of design intent, the management and coexistence, their collaboration with their designed ecosystem by participation, you can help them get what they want using our Cheap to Keep Tree and Landscape Protocol. Introduce them to this protocol. Explain to them that it has an aspect to it which is designed to protect their asset, to shift the services to a green basis that are efficient and cheap to keep, and that they can do this with less risk and less cost by using a repeatable protocol, gradually explaining the ecosystem services and this value proposition of the new green shift as you go. You've got to learn it first. You've got to become comfortable with it. We use this for years. Gradually talking to people, and every time we'd go back to perform an additional service, we would give them the benefits and would point out to them that by participating, that we are validating this protocol by recording the information, by being attentive to what is happening. And the only part of our company that has not changed since we started tree preservation back in 2000, going on 12 years now, has been the 10 steps of this protocol. You're going to have to learn it, you're going to have to use it, and you're going to have to rely on it as a track to run on. And that's why you're going to tout it as cheap to keep, as a new view, as a green and growing benefit that they will use over the next 4 or 5 or 6 years as the housing market recovers. They can build these values in their home by making their property cheap to keep, making less risk, less cost, and less maintenance and improvement hassles that come with managing a very diverse ecosystem simpler and easier for them and anyone else involved in the management and maintenance. It's a team approach, and you will be the major part of that team using the Cheap to Keep Trees and Landscapes protocol.